Hold on. Not
Yes, we see it.
yeah, just give us a chance here. We're trying to, there it goes. Your sound is on. Okay, very good. And I want to minimize these. Okay, all right. Thank you for joining us this evening. Let's get on with the show. First thing I want to do is I want to pose a question to you. A question, just answer it to yourself. Which bee is the most effective at pollinating tomatoes? A honeybee, perhaps the bumblebee, or perhaps you've never thought about it before and you would say, I don't know. Well, to answer this, I'm going to read a paragraph from this book, Our Native Bees by Paige Embry, because I felt that she answered the question so well. So from her book, tomatoes have some flexibility in their pollination requirements. Some pollination happens as a result of wind just shaking the plants, but more and bigger tomatoes result with the help of bees. Not just any bee can do it though. It wasn't until I was nearly 50 that I learned that honeybees can't produce those tasty red and orange globes. Tomatoes require a special kind of pollination called buzz pollination, where a bee holds onto a flower and vibrates certain muscles that shake the pollen right out of the plant. Honeybees don't know how to do it, but certain native bees do. I was appalled. How could I, a serious gardener for many years, not have learned that it takes a native bee, not a European import, to properly pollinate a tomato? So I asked other people I knew, veteran gardeners and non-gardeners alike, and it turns out that I was not the slow-witted exception. Not only did the people I talked to not know that honeybees couldn't pollinate tomatoes, many didn't know that honeybees weren't native to North America.
There we go.
And like the author of this book, I didn't know that bumblebees pollinate tomatoes. Yet I've been a vegetable gardener for 50 years, so don't feel badly, you didn't know either. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is show a short video about buzz pollination.
Back in West Virginia, the diverse vegetation of the uncultivated areas between farmlands is home to the best known relative of the honeybee, the bumblebee.
By the state, and this is I may not.
Some bumblebee populations are in decline, a tragedy since they are among the few bees capable of buzz pollination. This technique is the only efficient way to pollinate plants like tomatoes, eggplants, and blueberries. The bumblebee grabs the flower by the anthers, decouples its flight muscles from the wings, and uses them to shake the flower violently. The only way to get the blossom to dislodge its pollen. Which the bumblebees bring back to their colony.
Okay, just a reminder that if you haven't yet, if you could please mute yourself so we aren't getting any interference. Okay, so why should we care about bees or the native bees? This here is a photograph of a Whole Foods market in Providence, Rhode Island. And you are seeing your produce choices with bees. There's a saying that's pretty common, and it's that one of every third bite of food relies upon pollinators. So here's what you have with the bees, and here's what you have without the bees. 52%
Oh, wow.
of normal produce product is gone. So gone are the apples, broccoli, kale, leeks, onions, avocados, zucchini, cantaloupe, celery, bok choy, kale, squash. All those bits of produce that require bee pollination are now gone. We're left with things like tomatoes that, although they benefit from pollination, they don't have to have pollination. One paper I read said that if all the pollinators died off, we might not starve to death, but we'd likely get vitamin deficiency disorders. And you can see that the animal pollinated plants contribute to 98% of our vitamin C, 70% of our vitamin A, 55% of folic acid, etc. So that's why the bees matter to us. All right, so let's talk about bees. There are 20,000 species worldwide. 4,000 of those species are native to North America. What do I mean by native? By native, for our purposes tonight, the definition I'm using for native is it was here prior to European colonization. So those honeybees were brought over as a consequence of European colonization. And specifically in Connecticut, we have about 340 Connecticut native bees. Most native bees are kind of different from probably what you're most familiar with. Probably most people are familiar with honeybees and how they live in a hive and there's thousands of them together. Most native bees are different. Most native bees are solitary. They live alone. One exception, there's a few exceptions, but probably the most prominent one are the bumblebees. And I'll talk about them a little bit more later. Only female bees can sting, but rarely. In fact, most bees cannot sting at all. They nest in holes in the ground. In fact, about 70% of the native bees are ground nesting. And they're also opportunistic. They'll take over beetle holes, holes that are made by other animals. They'll tunnel in bare soil. The carpenter bees will, drill a hole into wood, or they like to live in hollow stems. So what I'm going to do now is maybe like a greatest hits sampling of some of the species in Connecticut, because I figure you're probably not that familiar with the varieties of bees that we have. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few different kinds, just to give you a sense for them. So of those 340 bees that are native to Connecticut, 20 species are mason bees. And what we're seeing here is a cutout of a mason bee nest. And you can see the way the nest is constructed is there is a mud partition. And that's why they're called mason bees. It's because they use mud to create a separation between the brood cells. So you see the mason bee egg cell, and that brown blob that I'm pointing at with the arrow on the left, that is a combination of nectar and pollen. And then the egg, the white egg, has been laid on it. And then the separators between the brood cells are made of mud, hence the mason name. One of the types of mason bees is a blue orchard bee, otherwise called a bob. And they're very efficient pollinators of apples. Very few of them, relatively speaking, can pollinate an acre of trees, compared to maybe 40,000 honeybees. And the reason they're so effective is because the way they carry their pollen. If you look in the upper right corner at that bob, the pollen is all over its abdomen. And essentially, when they go up to a flower, they do a belly flop on it. And so the pollen gets spread all over the place. You may have heard about these bees because you can buy bee houses for them if you look in the lower right corner, which basically consist of tubes that they can use to put their brood cells in. It's a great way to bring in native mason bees. I would caution you, however, to read the directions. You can't just slap it up anywhere in your yard. It should have a certain exposure. And chances are you'll need to change those tubes periodically. pests and predators can get habituated to where something is located. So you might need to move it. And also disease can spread if you keep the tubes in there too long. But I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm just suggesting follow the directions. All right, of those 340 bees, we also have 10 species of cellophane, otherwise known as polyester bees. And if you look at that bee on the left panel, it is sticking its tongue out at you, and it is a forked tongue. And that is unusual. And what they do with their forked tongues is they spread a liquid around in their brood cells. And when that liquid dries, it turns into a clear film. And that's why they call them cellophane bees. On the right, we have a digger bee. Digger bees are known for their long tongues, which brings up another characteristic of bees. There are bees with short tongues, and there are bees with long tongues. And the digger bee happens to have a long tongue. So if you're a short-tongued bee, you are going to be able to access shallow flowers. If you're a long-tongued bee, you can access deep flowers. Now you might think to yourself, well, that means a long-tongued bee can also access shallow flowers. But it's a little more subtle than that. And the analogy I'm going to use is if you think of a deep pot of soup. If you're trying to get the soup at the bottom of the pot, you'll use a long ladle, like a long-tongued bee. But suppose you just want to eat a bowl, a shallow bowl of soup. Well, the ladle is kind of clumsy, and you need something shorter to access the shallow bowl of soup. So just because you have a long-tongued bee doesn't mean you are very effective. Just because you have a long tongue doesn't mean you're very effective at getting at shallow flowers. Okay, and we also have here, of the 340 species of bees in Connecticut, we have more than 91 of them that are sweat bees. And the description that I got for a sweat bee was, one way to describe them is, they never met a flower that they did not like, and they rarely find one whose pollen and nectar that they cannot get at. They are not specialists, but generalists, taking pollen and nectar indiscriminately. There are many other species of those 340, mostly solitary. I was going to talk about the squash bee, but then yesterday I ran across this video, and I'm going to show that instead. It's a few minutes long, and I think it really kind of gives you a flavor for the lifestyle of one of these solitary bees. So as you're watching it, just try to think about what you know about honeybees and these hives with tens of thousands of bees and what it's like to be a native bee. So let's see if we can get this going. Okay, there might be an ad at the beginning. Nope, we're good.
Squash bee natural history. There are an estimated 4,000 species of bees native to North America, and research has shown that they pollinate many of the crops that we grow. One of these important crop pollinators is this bee, which is called Pipinapis pruinosa. It's also known as the squash bee. The squash bee, as its name suggests, is a specialist bee that relies on squash, pumpkins, and some gourds. These are all plants in the genus Cucurbita. These plants produce female flowers, which provide nectar that fuels the flight of bees, and male flowers, which in addition to nectar, produce pollen grains. Now, pollen grains are full of protein and fat and are what female squash bees are actively collecting to bring back to their nest to feed their young. In this picture, you can see how the pollen grains cling to the hairy bodies of the bees, and they'll use their long tongues to reach the nectar at the base of the flower. Now, when we think about bees, we typically think about this bee, which is the European honeybee. This bee lives in large social colonies, which we manage and truck around the country to pollinate our crops. But squash bees live a very different kind of life, and because they are ground nesting bees, actually spend most of their life underground. Here we have an adult female squash bee. In the early summer, she'll emerge from the ground and maybe start looking for a flower to fuel up on some nectar. At some point, a male will mate with her and then fly off to look for more females. Mated females will look for a good spot to put their nest. Now, we don't know exactly how they decide where to nest, but we do know that they like to be near squash and pumpkin vines. Once she's found a good spot, she'll dig out a tunnel and put a little cell at the end of that tunnel. Then she'll go off to find some squash and pumpkin flowers. Once she's found those flowers and collected some pollen, she'll go back to her nest and deposit that pollen at the base of the cell. She'll keep doing this until she has enough pollen for one baby. Once she's done that, she'll lay a single egg on top of that pollen, cap off that cell, and never see that baby again. Instead, she'll start making a new tunnel and cell, provisioning it with pollen, and laying another egg. And she'll keep doing this until she dies at the end of the summer. But if we focus on that egg that she laid, you'll see that it hatches into a larva, which will eat up all of that pollen, and then overwinter as a pre-pupa in a papery cocoon. In the spring, that bee will pupate and eventually emerge as an adult in the early summer. And that whole process will start all over again. So, when you're walking around your crop field or in your garden, be sure to look around your squash and pumpkin plants for squash bee nests. The entrances will be about the diameter of a pen or a pencil, and you may even be lucky enough to see a female entering the nest. Or, if you're digging around, you might find one of their papery cocoons, although these can be buried as deep as 18 inches, which is about 46 centimeters. And of course, you'll want to look for the bees themselves in your squash and pumpkin flowers. And if you don't know what you're looking for, you might confuse them with a honeybee, so be sure to watch our video on squash bee identification. Thanks for listening, and keep planting squash and pumpkin and supporting our amazing native bees. Funding for this video was provided by the Western Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program and the National Science Foundation's Graduate Student Research Fellowship Program. Additional support was provided by the Department of Entomology at the University of California in Davis.
Okay. All right, and now the final kind of native bee that I'm going to talk briefly about are the bumblebees. And on the left here,
Hey folks, look at here. We got us a monster. We got us a good 5-pound swarm right here. And this time I remembered a hive tool and a queen cage, so I don't have to go run back to the truck to get it. But here's what's really interesting.
okay, sorry about that, folks. I did not kill that off properly, apparently. Okay, and now, no, I don't want that. From the first slide? There you go. No. All right, sorry about that. Okay, here we are, back to the bumblebee. Okay, so we're back to the bumblebee. This is the eastern bumblebee, which is the most common bumblebee in our area. And if you notice underneath that, I have Bombus variabilis. That is the Latin name for the bumblebee. And you will see throughout this talk, whenever you see something italicized, the two names like that, that's the Latin genus and species for, whatever I am written about. One thing I'd like to point out about the bumblebee is it is a modern, the name bumblebee is a modern version of the Old English humblebee, which is also, there also is an Old English version called Dumbledore. So for those of you who are Harry Potter fans out there, J.K. Rowling apparently called him Professor Dumbledore, was Professor Bumblebee. All right, so because we are maybe more familiar with the honeybee, I'm going to do a little bit of compare and contrast between the honeybee and the bumblebee. As we already know, the honeybees are non-native and the bumblebees are native. Honeybee hives can be quite large, over 50,000 bees. Bumblebees, meanwhile, are considerably smaller. And earlier this year, the Garden Club had a Brantford beekeeper on, and he said that if If a hive was even as much as, say, 300 bees, he would have considered that a bumblebee hive as much as 300 bees. He would have considered that quite large. Honeybees, they make a lot of honey. Bumblebees don't. They make enough just for a rainy day. So, you know, if there's several days where they really can get out and forage, they have enough honey in their nest to, you know, take them for those few days, but they don't make honey like the honeybees do. Honeybees, we basically treat them as farm livestock. About 2/3 of the honeybees in this country are trucked to California starting in February. And over about a 2 to 3 week period, they're there to pollinate almonds. And then they're successively moved through the country for cherries, apples, blueberries. So like I say, we treat them as livestock. They're being used for their pollination services. Honeybees like it a little bit on the warmer side. Bumblebees, they can forage at above 40 degrees, but really a honeybee likes it better above 50. One of the other big differences between the honeybee and the bumblebee is the longevity of the queen bee. Honeybees the queen bee may last for 4 to 6 years, the bumblebee only for a year. So if we're going to use an analogy with plants, honeybees are perennials because they can live from year to year, the queens. Bumblebees and other native bees are annuals. They have one season and then the queen bee dies off. Right. I think it's probably been a few years since some of you have been in a biology class. So we're going to do a quick pollination 101 because I'm going to be talking a lot about pollination. All right, so if we look at the flower on the left, we see that the male part of the plant has an anther, and the anther is where the pollen forms. What the flower is hoping is that some pollinating insect will come by, have some pollen, you know, kind of attach itself to the body, and that insect, like a bee, will fly over to a flower on another plant, and those pollen grains will brush off onto the female part of the plant, onto the stigma, then pass down into the ovary, where pollination occurs and fruit and seeds form. Cross-pollination is when the pollen goes from the male on one plant to the female on another plant. There's an evolutionary advantage to this. The mixing of the genetics of the two plants in the subsequent generation might produce a plant that is drought tolerant or more insect resistant. So there's an evolutionary advantage to this. Even for those plants like tomatoes that don't have to be pollinated, if they get pollinated, they tend to grow larger fruit and more fruit. However, suppose there's a number of rainy days, the pollinators can't really get out. What you can end up with then is some plants can control their pollination and they will self-pollinate. It's sort of like a last-ditch effort. At least I'll produce fruit and seeds and I'll live again for another year. But you don't get the mixing of the genetics and the creation of potentially new advantageous features. All righty, so flowers produce nectar. Nectar contains nutrients like proteins and vitamins and fats and sugar. It takes energy for the flower to produce the nectar. The flower is not producing the nectar out of the goodness of its heart. It's a lure. It's to lure the bees in with the hope that the bee will go for the nectar, brush against the pollen, and then go to another flower on another plant and complete the pollination process. Some flowers or some plants, they even have caffeine in their nectar. And it's a way of hoping to habituate the bees to come back to those plants, to repeat them. So the flower is kind of rigged. As the bee goes in to get the nectar, it brushes against the male part of the plant and collects the pollen, and then it goes off to do pollination. Bees, however, from their viewpoint, they don't care about pollinating. That's not what they're for. The bees are there because they need food. They need pollen for reproduction, because remember the cutout we saw of the mason bee? They collect that pollen that the bee larvae need as food. Bees also need nectar for their own survival. That's the energy that they get to fly, or like with a honeybee or a bumblebee, to make honey, which is stored food. And I think it was that distinction between pollen and nectar that until I started this, I really wasn't aware of that. I just, yeah, bees get nectar, they get pollen, but I didn't realize why it was so important. And if you look in the lower right, there's a bumblebee there with a pollen load. Unlike that mason bee at the beginning that had the pollen all over its abdomen, the bumblebee carries the pollen around on its leg, and that's what you see there. All right, so I think a lot of people are familiar with the concept that monarch butterflies need milkweed. They need to have milkweed so that when they lay their eggs, the eggs will hatch and the caterpillars eat the milkweed plants. And you can't raise young monarch butterflies without having milkweed. There is a similar situation in the bee world. Certain bees need to have certain specific pollens to raise their young. And an example of that is that there's 11 species of the northeastern native bees that need goldenrod pollen. If you don't have goldenrod growing in your yard or a neighbor's yard, these bees like this cannot live in your yard. The native bees don't only travel a few hundred feet. So if you don't have a local food source and a local source of whatever they need specifically to feed their baby bees, their larvae, they can't live there. And an example of a bee that's like this is in the lower left corner. The goldenrod cellophane bee needs this. And in fact, 15% of our native bees, northeastern native bees, are pollen specialists, and they have to have a specific plant to produce pollen that they feed to their bee larvae. All right, so some fun facts. What does a bee see? All right, humans, you know, we see red, orange, yellow, blue, green, blue, and violet. Bees don't see red. Now, that's not to say you should rip out all your red flowers because the bees can't access them. It turns out they actually will pollinate red flowers because they can see a contrast between the red flowers and the green leaves. But they really prefer the yellow into the violet. And they also can see into the ultraviolet, and we'll see why that's important now. Let's look at a flower. If I look at that foxglove on the left and I see those markings, I think, oh, how pretty. I did not realize that those markings serve a purpose. Those are nectar guides. And they're basically a pathway. It's like the yellow brick road. It's telling the bee, follow the yellow brick road, follow this pathway, and you will get nectar. Look at the violet in the middle there. Those lines going into the center, that's telling the bee, come to the center. This is where you're going to find nectar. Now, on the right though, look at the black-eyed Susan. What we see is the yellow flower with the black cone or brown cone in the middle. The bee, because it can see in the ultraviolet, sees something different. It sees this bullseye pattern around the center. And once again, that's a clue to the bee that this is where you want to go. And that's very common. I found this whole website that had all these pictures in the ultraviolet, and many of the flowers had these bullseye patterns, which can only be seen in the ultraviolet, which means only the bees can see them. All right, so what's going on with the bees? In 2006, we started to hear about colony collapse disorder for the honeybees. And essentially what was happening was the worker bees were going out to collect nectar and they were simply not returning home. And upwards of beekeepers were losing upwards of 90% of their hives. At that time, it seemed to me, as I was reading about this, that they started looking around for, I guess, what I call a silver bullet. What is the one thing that's causing this? And I think in the intervening years, it's become obvious that there may not have been one thing causing this, but there may be multiple stressors that are causing colony collapse disorder. And this, the problems, these stressors, it's not just honeybees. The native bees are experiencing them as well. So I'm just going to explain what some of the stressors are. One of the stressors is non-native species. So for example, if you don't have goldenrod in your yard, those bees that depend on that can't live there. So if you don't have the native species, the native goldenrod, those bees can't live there. There's problems with infectious agents, mites, viruses, fungal pathogens that can attack the bees. Habitat change. We have very tidy landscapes. Our landscapes are not conducive to bee habitat. We've lost floral abundance. If you think about acres and acres of, say, cornfields or soybean fields, the bees, there's nothing there for them. So these monocultures are problematic. And then on the next slide, we're going to talk about pesticides. All right, so the pesticides. One class of pesticides or insecticides that has been, research is showing is definitely causing a problem for bees are the neonicotinoids, or sometimes you'll hear them referred to as neonics. They are systemic insecticides. So if you spray this insecticide onto a plant, it's not just going to hit the plant, it's going to go down to the soil, dissolve there, and get drawn up into the plant's leaves, flowers, and pollen. So think about it. A bee comes by and gathers some pollen, uses it, and the bee larvae are now trying to subsist on pollen that contains an insecticide. And even sublethal doses can be harmful, leading to many impairments that you can see on the screen. And then climate change. That was the final issue. There's a number of papers that have come out recently. This is one that came out a little over a year ago. And basically what the scientists did was they looked at bee populations from 1901 to 1974. And they compared bumblebee, this is specifically bumblebees, they compared bumblebee populations from those first 75 years or so to bumblebee populations from 2000 to 2014. And what they saw was that in North America, you're 46% less likely to see a bumblebee than you were in 1974. And in Europe, it's 17% less likely. What is happening? Okay, so think about the bumblebee. The bumblebee can tolerate colder temperatures than the honeybee. By the same token, it's less tolerant of hotter temperatures. And so what's happening is with climate change, our lower swath of bumblebee species are experiencing difficulties. They're trying to migrate north with the heat changes, but they're not migrating fast enough. And so what we're facing now is we may lose some of our bumblebee species. They may become extinct within a few decades with climate change. So, but what can we do to help? All right, what's our action plan? I'm going to talk about a few different things here that you can do to help. Pick something that resonates with you. Some of the things you can do are to plant things. I personally think planting things is a lot of fun, so go plant stuff. That's a lot of fun. So in the next few slides, we're going to look at where to plant, what to plant, how to plant, and some bee-friendly gardening practices. The first question I think you need to ask yourself is you need to look at your living space. And here's an example of what I would call a stereotypical suburban property. And the question I ask is, does your property provide food and habitat for bees? And if it looks like this, the answer is probably not. If you look at the lawn, there's nothing there. There's no flowers, no pollen, no nectar for the bees. Unfortunately, a lot of the plantings, our trees and shrubs around our houses are also non-native. So they may be of only a limited usage to the bees. And the fact that our properties are so neatly manicured also is problematic for our native pollinators. So those lawns, we have a lot of them. They occupy a rather large space in our country, a size greater than New England. So one possibility that you have to create more habitat for bees is to cut back your lawn. And a challenge might even be to cut it back by 50%. You could create something like what we see here. Now, basically on the left screen, what you're seeing is the lawn is just being used as a way to connect you from one area to another. On the right screen, this is a house where basically all the property around it has been landscaped so that it includes plantings. Now, you may not want to or be able to do something quite as complete as that. But what I'd like to encourage you to do, though, is even if you can just put a small bee-friendly garden into your property, it would be helpful. Because if you do that and a neighbor does that and another neighbor does that, we kind of stitch together what we could call a pollinator pathway. All right, so that was where to plant if you give over some of your lawn. Let's look next at what to plant. So what we need to do is to plant native species. Those are the plants that the bees have evolved with, like the goldenrod. But just because it's native doesn't mean you can plunk it down anywhere. You have to do the right plant in the right place. So if you have a plant that says it needs shade and it needs moisture, don't put it out where it's dry and in the sun. Just because it's native doesn't mean that you can put it anywhere. How do you know whether something's a native species? Well, let me give you a first clue. What are native species? If the plant name includes origins from somewhere else, it's not a native species. If it says Japanese, Siberian, Norway, European, English, it's not native. So that's one clue. The one exception I found, and this is not, I mean, there's probably others, but this is the one I found, has to do with the sunflower. Sunflowers, annual sunflowers are native to North America, but the seeds have been sold elsewhere in the world and hybridized. So sometimes you'll find annual sunflowers that are Russian or Italian or Mongolian. As far as I know, those should be fine as well. So they're still native, even though they might have been hybridized somewhere else, sort of. All right, so I like lists. So for those of you out there who like lists and want to have a list to take with you to a garden center, get out your phone and take a picture for the next 3 slides. This is the slide of the wildflowers. Now, I looked in that book, Feed the Bees, 100 Plants to Feed the Bees, and this book covers the entire United States. What I did was I went through and I picked out those plants that are native to our area. And you'll see that there's a few of them that have been highlighted. Those, like the aster, and not highlighted, turned red. The aster, the goldenrod, and the perennial sunflower. The reason those are red is because those specifically help those bees that are specialist bees that must have pollen from a specific plant. So I'd like to encourage you, if you can, to plant, some of those that are in red. And then in addition to that, plant anything else that is on the list. In the right column, there's purple coneflower. And there's a recent paper that came out. If you just Google Mount Cuba Center captivating coneflowers, you can find some of the best coneflowers. There's so many different hybridizations of coneflowers out there. You can find the ones that are best. They did a study there, the ones that are best for pollinators. So the next slide, those were the wildflowers. I did the same for the native trees and shrubs. And once again, the blueberry and the willow, those are ones where bees need a specific kind of pollen for their young. I'd like to caution you, if you look at something like the basswood, the Tilia americana, there are many different kinds of basswood. And make sure you get the one that's listed with this genus and species, the Tilia americana. That's the one from America. There's European ones. Or if you read down the list, you'll see rhododendron. There are many Asian or rhododendrons. You don't want to get those. If you're looking for native, you want to get the ones that are listed here. Or even like a willow. Pussy willow is native, but A weeping willow is not. So you need to be careful and use the genus and species to get the specific thing that is native. And then our last list, before you think that I totally hate all non-natives, non-natives serve a purpose too. And basically I'm shuffling through my papers here, most of our foods are non-native. So these plants that I have listed here are non-native, but they are particularly good for pollinators. They can still provide pollen and nectar. It's just that they can't so much provide pollen for the specialist bees that need it. Okay, so where are you going to get your native plants and seeds? A really good source for seeds is a Prairie View Nursery. It's online, you put in an order. I have never tried their bare root plants or their potted plants, but I have bought seeds from them and had good success from that. Unfortunately, well, the Connecticut River Coastal Conservation District native plant sale, so it's already set up for you, it's natives. The time for that this year has come and gone. They asked for the orders by April 1st of 2020, April 1st of this year. So I'm going to have to ask you to roll it over to 2022. And you order online and you go pick it up. So like I say, unfortunately, it's too late for this year, but last year it was canceled and I waited into this year to order for this year. Okay, now Branford Community Garden and the Garden Club plant sale on the Branford Green. This is my shameless plug because I am a member of both. We will be having a plant sale on the Branford Green in mid-May. And we have herbs and vegetable seedlings and flower seedlings, and we're making a big push this year to try to have native plants. So if you come on by, please support these two not-for-profit organizations. Another place to find native plants is if you go online, look at nativeplanttrust.org. They specialize in native plants of New England. And in fact, they have a nursery in Massachusetts. It's right off of 91, a little ways off of 91, kind of north of Amherst. And that's where you can go and they have all native plants of New England. And finally, you can look at garden centers. Any local garden center. And this is for people even who aren't here from Branford. Just go look for native wherever your garden center is. Now, for us here along the Connecticut coast, you might see this designation of Ecoregion 59. The country is divided into different ecoregions. So, and Ecoregion 59 includes Connecticut, Rhode Island, and coastal Massachusetts. And if you think about it, this ecoregion would be different from the White Mountains of New Hampshire, for example. So these plants here are maybe a little different from those elsewhere in New England. You do not have to buy Ecoregion 59 plants, but what it does mean is that the seeds have specifically been sourced from our ecoregion and are kind of conditioned to our particular climate. All right, now, one other thing to be aware of are, and this is true mostly for sunflowers, but not exclusively. Beware the pollenless and double and ruffled flowered plants. Now, if you look on the left, you can see the lemon queen. It has like a yellow band around it, and that's where the pollen is. There are also sunflower seeds that it should say on the package, it says that they are pollenless. Now that is great for the cut flower trade. If you were putting together a bouquet of flowers for a bride, and she's not going to want to have pollen, trickling down her gown. So you're going to want pollenless flowers, or maybe to bring a bouquet in from outside to put on your table. Maybe you don't want to deal with the pollen. But if you're trying to feed the bees, you're not going to do it with pollenless sunflowers. Now, they do provide nectar, but they don't provide pollen. So if you really want to help the bees, get flower seeds that have pollen. Now, another thing to be aware of, though, if you look at the far right, look at teddy bear. That sunflower is advertised as double. And whatever seeds you see, and this is true for many different flowers, sometimes you'll see them, they're called double flowers, ruffled flowers. Those are not very good for the bees. And I think it can be kind of obvious. The way they make these flowers is they turn the male part of the flower into more petals. So there's no pollen there. And even if it were, look at that flower. There's no way a bee can even get into it. So if you're planting for the bees, even though these flowers look beautiful to us, all these double and ruffled flowers, they're not good for the pollinators. How do you plant? All right, so if you're into garden design, you already know that you're going to plant in 3s and 5s and 7s. Don't put one plant down and then 100 feet away, put another plant down. Put them together in a group, create an area that's by 3 by 3, make it easier for the pollinator to find it. And the other thing you want to do is you want to have a number of different things blooming at the same time. It creates a more varied diet for the bees. So let's look at this. Now, this came from the Connecticut Ag Station. You can go there and access this list. The horizontal column are the months of the year. The vertical column are a list of trees and shrubs. And this is a graph of what is in bloom over the growing season. So let's look at the trees. Trees start blooming in March. That's important because the bumblebees need, the pregnant queen bumblebee comes out of hibernation when you start having days over 50 degrees. She needs to get nectar. And that might be in March. So what we see is that the blooming starts in March with our trees and our shrubs. And the trees and shrubs go from March on through to August. Now, let's look at a similar graph for the wildflowers. As you know, most of our wildflowers, they aren't blooming in March and April, right? They start blooming in May and they go on through October. That breadth of bloom from March to October is important. Once again, specifically for bumblebees and other bees. Honeybees find it useful too. But the bees that are alive towards the end of the season, September and October, they're like the queen bumblebee, she's trying to increase her resources, so she's able to hibernate. So it's very, very important, in particular, that we have things in bloom at the end of the growing season, so September into October. And if you notice there, the goldenrods and the asters are at the bottom of the list and they're available then. All right, so what are some bee-friendly gardening practices? Everybody should like this one. Don't clean up the garden in the fall. Remember that some of those bees like to nest in the hollow stems. Leave them there over the winter. Wait until the spring, until you've had at least a week of 50-degree days. That allows the bees to come out and start finding wherever they're going to nest for the summer. This year, it seemed to me, the week starting March 20th, we had a week full of 50-degree days. So, at this point, it was okay to cut down all those stalks that were sticking up all winter long. Another thing you can do is leave the leaves on your perennial beds. Sure, you want to take the leaves off of your grass. Leave them on your perennial beds. It provides habitat for nesting bees and for caterpillars. And you might wonder, well, okay, I leave them on over the winter. What happens next spring? When do I rake them off? And the answer is don't. Why bother? Why not just let them turn into mulch? They block the weeds from growing, and there's just no point. So I think, we in order to benefit our pollinators, we have to get used to a slightly less manicured, maybe you might even say a little messier way of looking at our yards, a more natural way of looking at our yards in order to protect our pollinators. And then finally, if you're a vegetable gardener, if a plant is bolting, like this radish in the bottom, unless you're going to plant something in it, immediately afterwards and you need the space, why not just let it bolt? It's great for the bees. And here we go. And my final slide is, in Branford and in many other towns in Connecticut, and I'm sure in other states as well, there are these pollinator pathway initiatives. And if you want to get on an email for the Branford group, you can see it there written in blue. And in fact, they're having a work party coming up this coming Saturday in the morning over at 16 Birch Road. They're trying to clear out an area and create what is going to be part of a pollinator pathway. And what we're hoping when creating a pollinator pathway is that we can get individual properties in town to plant, have pollinator friendly practices, plant things that benefit the pollinators, don't rake up your leaves. But if you don't have your own property or can't do that there, you can work on this townwide initiative and help out in that way as well. All right. So I was at a talk a year and a half ago, and the speaker was talking about how she had a gardening project and it wasn't going well. And she was sort of lamenting that. And she said, a friend turned to me and said, we don't need to be perfect, but we do need to be gooder. And that stuck with me. It stuck with me both because of the improper use of the word good, but that feeling that, don't get overwhelmed. Anything we can do, no matter how small, whether it be a patio pot with flowers in it that the bees can visit, or turning over your entire lawn to native plantings. Anything you can do in between. It doesn't need to be perfect, but we need to do gooder than we have been so far. So what we need to do is we need to go native and have a goal of 70% native species in your yard. Now, suppose you love roses or hostas or whatever it is. I am not suggesting to you that you rip everything out. But what I am suggesting is that maybe when a plant dies out, put in a native plant. Or if you can set aside a new area in your yard, put in a native tree. And under that native tree, put in native shrubs. And under that, put in native flowers and native ground covers. And if you don't have room for another tree, just put in some flowers that are native. Anything that we can do to improve will be gooder. And so we need to put back the nectar and pollen sources that we've taken away basically with our lawns and our non-native plantings. The bees are depending on us for their food. We are depending on them for our food. Because if you plant it, if you provide food and habitat for the bees, they will come. Thank you. And I'm done now.
We have some chat.
I need to get back into.
Malaine, that was terrific. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you.
It was. We learned so much.
So well organized.
Malaine, just hit stop sharing.
Stop sharing. Thank you,
Yeah.
Sharon.
mhm.
There we
There
go.
we go.
All right.
Mhm.
So now I guess I need to probably look at the chat
Look
and
at the
see
chat.
what's there.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. Oh, okay. So if I'm digging a hole for a plant, can I disturb the exit or entrance of the squash bee? Now, folks, keep in mind, all right, as we said at the beginning, I'm not an expert about this. I'm just sharing with you what I learned. And so probably a lot of my answers are going to be, I don't know. All right. And the answer to this question about digging a hole and disturbing the exit or entrance, I don't know what's going to happen, if you disturb it. Whether or not the baby bee will be able to make its way out. I think it's really remarkable that those bees, the squash bees, can dig down 7 inches. And one thing that I read was saying they put the baby bees down there to avoid tillage, which I can't imagine a squash bee actually thinks, well, if a plow's coming through, it'll be safer down there. But so I really don't know. I mean, I think the stuff, if we avoid disturbing bees as much as possible, that's probably best, but perhaps they can drill their way, the baby bees, after they hatch back up. I just don't know. All right, can a coneflower be planted in a container and will it last through the winter? What I don't know specifically about coneflowers. Some plants that are perennials, if they are above ground, will freeze. And so if you plant something like that, you might want to have it overwinter in your garage or just someplace that's not going to be frozen. Coneflowers might be hardy enough that if they're above ground in a pot, they overwinter. I just don't know. What about mountain laurel? Yes, mountain laurel's a native. And I believe that's our Connecticut native, isn't it?
Yes.
So yeah, definitely.
Great fire, yeah.
Now, oh, but let me think about that. Now, mountain laurel, you know, I read something, and I'm not sure. There are some plants that are actually not good for bees to pollinate. And it's actually kind of, yeah, you know what? If I were you, I would Google that and just see if it is good for them to pollinate. I know there's like a few things that aren't. Mountain laurel is definitely a native, but just look up native shrub lists for Connecticut and see if it's on there and recommended for bees. What does one safely do about carpenter bees that are drilling many holes in one's deck? And the answer is, I don't know. I know somebody who recently told me, you know, she invited somebody in to get rid of the bees. And I don't know what to say because it's your deck, right? I have them, they're drilling holes back in a shed out in the backyard. And, you know, that I don't care about, but I don't know how to, I would call, well, I would call the Connecticut Ag Station actually and ask them. That brings up a good point, that if you have questions like this, the Connecticut Ag Station is a really good resource. It's like the Connecticut Agricultural and Experimental Station, and they would be able to answer questions like that. All right, so we have an idea for future talks, sustainable fisheries. That's great. And oh, thank you. And do leaf blowers disrupt bee nests? I would think probably yes. Because my whole thing is just leave the leaves. If you're using the leaf blower on your lawn, chances are the bees aren't there anyway, so that should be a problem. But I probably would go over a perennial area with leaves on it and blow them off of that. Because sometimes the nesting bees are just underneath the leaves, quite frankly. So I think that could be problematic. All right, I'm seeing my neighbors over here. All right, let's see. And in the fall, we have stinging yellow jackets nesting in the yard. Do they pollinate? And should I stop trying to remove them? Yeah, the answer is, one thing, okay, I don't know if I can directly answer this question, but this is a slide that I left out. I do want to just mention it. Wasps are meat eaters. They're meat eaters. And bees evolved from wasps, probably somewhere around 10,000 years ago. So basically, a bee is a wasp that has gone vegetarian. And if you think about it, if you're a wasp and you're a meat eater, that is it's kind of risky. You know, your food will fight back. And so there was an evolutionary advantage to the bees because by going vegetarian, your food doesn't fight back, your flowers don't fight back at you. So if I were to guess about the yellow jackets, I would say they probably aren't the best pollinators because they're meat eaters. But once again, you know, I would probably just call the Connecticut Ag Station and ask them. Or, oh, that's the other point. The Connecticut Ag Station is and also Yukon, okay? You can go on to both places, the Connecticut Ag Station, and type in like some keywords, and papers will come up that will talk about a given topic. So you might be able to find your answer there as well. Yukon also has this home and garden resource that's really good, that they might have that answered there too. Oh, can I talk about neonics? Ah, yes. Well, I believe Home Depot sells flowers that are grown using this pesticide. That is one concern that, and I can't see whether or not Home Depot does that or not. Okay, I just don't know. But that can be a concern that you can bring home plants from a garden center that have been treated with neonicotinoids, and it can be harmful to the bees. I don't know exactly how to get around that. One thing I would hope, though, is that like a place like Nature Works up in Northford, they are entirely organic. And I would hope that they've made sure that they've sourced their plants. I mean, you know, I'm sure they have. They've sourced their plants to make sure they weren't grown with neonics. But yeah, other places that can be definitely a concern.
Malaine, do you know if those have to be labeled?
I don't know.
Mm.
I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't. And that, you know, once again, I'm going to point you to the Kinetic Ag Station. Okay. That's a great place to get, like, those are the scientists there that are doing it. Laughing. Okay. Oh, some ways to get started with composting. Okay. So, all right. So on April 17th, so a week and a half from now, on Saturday, I'm going to be on the Brantford Green. That morning is Brantford Cleanup Day. And so people are going to go out into the town and clean up the waterways and bring the junk. I assume they're going to bring the junk back to the green and get rid of it in a dumpster there. But in the afternoon from noon to 4, there are going to be a number of us on the green talking about things. And I'm going to be there talking about composting. I'm going to have a display all about how to do home composting and why you want to do home composting. So there's my little plug about that. So how to get started with composting? I really just like to direct you to come to that. I'll have just a lot of information there, but you just start collecting your food scraps, basically. And I'm not going to be the only one there, though. There's also going to be this Blue Earth, which is an organization where if you don't want to compost, they will come collect your food scraps and take them away. And they are put into a digester, which then in turn makes electricity. So there's going to be a number of different ways that you can work on getting rid of your food scraps. So if you can, come to that. And there's also a possibility that I might be doing an online presentation later in April or in May through the Blackstone Library. It hasn't been scheduled yet, where I will be talking about how to compost. So, all right. Oh, can't leaves be too heavy and matted in a flower bed. You suggest I leave them all. Yeah, I do. Except, all right, I'll be honest. If there's like a plant I know there that it's trying to come out and it's struggling, you know, or I can see those little crocuses trying to push through, you know, I'll pull a little bit apart from the crown of the plant. But if you leave it around the plants, the leaves around the plants, it just acts as mulch, you know, and keeps the weeds down and keeps the moisture in. So it's really advantageous, unless it's truly choking something out and preventing it from growing. I would just leave them there, because let's look at it this way. What does nature do? The leaves fall from the trees in the forest. Plants come up under them, you know, that's nature. And I mean, I suppose if you have a foot or two of leaves, maybe that's a different story. But for the most part, what would typically fall, I wouldn't worry about. So we have somebody here answering that. The new beekeeper. I became aware of mountain laurel and azaleas not being recommended for honeybees. Yeah, so that's kind of what I was, you know, kind of vaguely remembering, that some things aren't very good for them. I think it kind of poisons the honey a little bit. Yeah, they're not good for them. Last year I planted goldenrod for my bees, and they were a number of types of wasps that were pollinating it. I don't know what to say to that. There might be. I mean, I'm not going to stand firmly and say that wasps never pollinate. The other thing I might say, though, is there might be things that look like wasps, but they're actually bees. That's another possibility. But I'm not going to dispute it. And thank you for putting that in there, that there may be, you know, maybe the wasps do, but they're meat eaters. Is there anything else? Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Everyone
am-
beware, everybody is muted. You may think you didn't mute, but I may have muted you. So if you're wanting to say something to Malaine, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, and let me point out, so we have talks. There's one next week, right?
Mhm.
We have a
Yes.
talk next week about trees. Nick Vallis, a local arborist, is coming and talking about trees, 7 p.m. At the same Zoom link. And then the week after that, we're having Judy Preston speak, and she's going to be talking about yard, like ways to take care of your yard, your property, that are not detrimental to, especially to like the water going to the London Sound. And I'm sure Nick will be wonderful. I've heard wonderful things about him, but I also personally, Judy Preston did one of my master composter classes, and she was quite enjoyable. So I would like to encourage everybody out there to come back the next 2 weeks and listen to these other two wonderful speakers.